Hello, team players, and welcome to the conversation with the Tennessee Titans. Bob, there's so much going on with the Titans this year, mostly in the negative perception department. And as we look at this, it really comes down to is Levis any good? I mean, unless I'm missing something, that's basically what this conversation with the Titans comes down to. When we look at from a betting standpoint, their over-under is listed at 6.5. But the reality says they're only favored in one game the entire season. A lot of hurdles for this team to get over, and a lot of fantasy perks can come out of it. Where do you think it's going to happen, Bob?
Thing, Joe. I had to change my headphones because we were picking up a lot of interference on that. So here's the thing about the Tennessee Titans is that when we go back and look at their year last year, they were very heavily dependent on getting Will Levis up to speed because there had been so much it's a mismanaged situation that Tennessee has had ever since Ryan Tannehill got hurt. They thought Malik Willis might be a guy. He's definitely not even a guy.
No, he wasn't.
And then they brought in Tajay Spears last year, and that started to get a little bit of work away from Derrick Henry. Derrick Henry aging. But then, their offensive line was pure garbage almost the entire year. And they've been steadily trying to get pieces to make that offensive line better because Malik Willis was on his back half the time scrambling. He didn't know what he was doing. Ryan Tannehill was always practically on his back. And it's usually a pretty average run-of-the-mill kind of team. When A.J. Brown was on the team a couple years back, that set them apart. That made them a little bit more elite. And then they went out and they got DeAndre Hopkins, and everybody said, well, this should be good for this franchise. It should be really good. And it is. DeAndre Hopkins is an amazing player, really good player. But unfortunately, what Tennessee never really had was a number two. Because Treylon Burks never really panned out. Nick Westbrook wasn't really doing anything good. And so we also had a couple other players, and then, their tight end, Chigga Okonkwo, these are all, when we go into, the dude category, they're all just guys. There's not like, other than DeAndre Hopkins and Derrick Henry, there wasn't really any great playmakers on the field or even no-name players that a typical standard audience might think of that could do.
Well, Hopkins is supposed to be that guy.
Well, I'm saying Hopkins is that guy, but what I'm saying is that they need somebody else because this is one of those problems that a lot of teams have where say you don't have good quarterback play. Let's say you don't have good offensive line play and you're relying on one threat out, off to the side, in the wide receiver category there. But you can't be successful with a young quarterback unless you have weapons around that quarterback consistently and you have a offensive line that could block for that quarterback. Now, they went out, they got a couple of those pieces, plus they ended up going out and getting Calvin Ridley. Now, do we think Calvin Ridley is going to change the dynamic of this team? I think so. They also went out and got Tony Pollard. Now, Tony Pollard wasn't the fantasy player that we wanted him to be last year. And the odds are saying, based on where he's being drafted and what round he's being drafted in, that he's probably not going to be that player again.
And where do we have Pollard ranked at?
I'm about to look that up right now. I just fired up all the devices here.
Well, on that note, let's break down what makes our rankings different, the way we look at things differently. Because we use the macro metrics of the advanced betting market. In English, this is basically how it goes down. Every single game for the entire season, people are betting on right now. And the further downfield the bets are, the less public skewing is there, meaning professionals are the one betting on their week 15 matchup, etc. So you take all of this collective data, and what you're able to do is compound what is the Titans' actual outcomes more likely to be. Last year, over 60% in our bet recommendations throughout the course of the year. Our fantasy numbers are likewise there as well. So when we are given information, this isn't just, hey, how we feel about it, but actually with math behind it to give detailed knowledge on the most important part, the projection for 24. Everyone knows what happened in 23, but what's going to happen in 24? Look at where the actual money is, where all of the variables are already included. Boom.
So what we have here in Tennessee, I'm going to go off of Underdog's value first. Okay.
Sure.
So Underdog is a fantasy platform that a lot of people use. And this is just where these players are ranked in terms of their overall rankings in their system.
Yeah, so the general consensus, essentially.
Right. So Calvin Ridley, 56th overall. DeAndre Hopkins, 68th overall.
Pollard, overall or receiver?
Overall.
Oh, okay. All right.
I'm going to read you the wide receiver.
That's a poke, man.
Tony Pollard, 101. Tajay Spears, 111. And Will Levis is sitting there at 179. They also got Tyler Boyd off of the Cincinnati Bengals. Now, when it comes to Fantasy Pros ranking of them in terms of their positional value, Calvin Ridley's at wide receiver 35, DeAndre Hopkins wide receiver 38, Pollard running back 29, Spears running back 33, Will Levis quarterback 24. So you're looking at it and you're saying, well, I'm getting a value. Well, last year and going into this year, this ranking comes from the Huddle, is that Tennessee Titans offensive line is ranked 27th in the league. And
they're bad last year.
As you look around to the other websites and other resources out there, Tennessee hasn't built yet what we think is going to be a really great offensive line. While Calvin Ridley is a good player, while DeAndre Hopkins is a good player, these players are coming out at a value usually somewhere around, you can get them in the 6th, 7th, 8th rounds of fantasy drafts. Tony Pollard and Tajay Spears are really usually popping off in the 8 to 10 rounds in most 10 and 12 team drafts. So you look at it and you say, okay, do I want these players? Calvin Ridley, when he was on Jacksonville, did get some red zone targets. That's really nice. DeAndre Hopkins is fairly decent at going down the field. Everything points to these players as saying, I should draft them at their value because everything looks to be going up for this team. It couldn't be any worse than last year. Our ranking, though, tends to see a different story in terms of the passing game. In our rankings, we have both Ridley and Hopkins falling outside of the wide receiver 40 range. So these are out of all wide receivers. We are not projecting DeAndre Hopkins or Calvin Ridley to have a phenomenal season.
That's exactly it.
Let's say you draft them and you're saying, well, what can I do? This is just an example here. We have a player like Michael Pittman being drafted in the 4th and 3rd rounds of leagues for Indy, and we're going to be talking about Indy soon. He's going off as a wide receiver in the top 30. But DeAndre Hopkins and Calvin Ridley on this type of team are two players that really, we talk about Green Bay and we talk about Houston and all these other teams that they're going to cannibalize themselves. These are two players that stylistically could perform very similarly, but may not be worth that wide receiver 35 or wide receiver 38 that Fantasy Pros is putting out here. Overall, you're looking at an average draft position of 64 and 72, which sits you right around in that 5th, 6th rounds. And we're just not seeing a lot of value out of these two players. Granted, they could come out and they could throw up 1,000 yards and 8 touchdowns. That's perfectly possible that this could happen. But it's not your best value in that market. Now,
it's not.
Going to the running backs, we actually have Tajay Spears ranked inside of our top 15 and Tony Pollard outside of our top 30 running backs. Now, when we look at these two players, again, stylistically, they're the same type of player.
They are.
Tony Pollard, though, is one of those players that should have been buoyed a lot by his opportunities in the red zone last year. We talked about this on previous episodes. And when we look at when we look at Tony Pollard, one of the reasons why he got a lot of opportunities is because he wasn't converting a lot of opportunities that he was given. So
Dallas didn't trust anyone else in the first half of their season.
He's at the 10, but he wasn't getting in. So of course you're going to get more opportunities if you're not getting in. And when you look at what Tony Pollard is to this team, we're not very and this is the thing, Joe. We're on Fantasy Pros, and we look at it and we say, okay, what quarterback? Levis is quarterback 24 on Fantasy Pros. He's quarterback 29 on our book. Now, if you're going to be statistically ranking wide receiver 35 and wide receiver 38, do you really want them to be tied to quarterback 24 and quarterback? That kind of metric is really scary, is that when I'm drafting a player in the 5th, 6th, 7th round, and they're tied to a quarterback that I'm not even sure that they could get the ball moving down the field consistently. Granted, I like Will Levis as a player. I think he does have some good stuff. But will that stuff be consistent enough to support 2 of these wide receivers? Granted, maybe I take one of them. Maybe I go after DeAndre Hopkins, but I want to get him later. I don't want to get him at that value. Our values throw him up as DeAndre Hopkins as the better player in comparison to Calvin Ridley. So if you are going to go after a Tennessee Titans wide receiver, we like DeAndre Hopkins more than Calvin Ridley. And if you're going to go after running back, we like Tyjae Spears more than Pollard, for the same fact that Tyjae Spears is younger, just came off of a great season last year, has been in the system. When you bring over a vet, and the rookie did just fine with that vet's there in our mind to support this team. And as a player for this team, this will be good for Tennessee as a whole. But fantasy-wise, this is not – Tony Pollard is really not a player that you want to draft at that value. And then going into the tight end, we have Chigok Inakwo. Fantasy Pros has him ranked as tight end 22. We have him ranked as tight end 23. And Tyler Boyd is ranked as their wide receiver 80 and our wide receiver 90. So when we look at it, this is a team that Tyler Boyd's a good player too. And
he is, but we look at this team overall, they're all, you said it perfectly. Do you really want to hinge a receiving room on a team that has the 24th or 27th quarterback? The defense that is projected by all over-under metrics to let up either the second most or most points over the span of the year. Do you really want to be having Will Levis behind the line of scrimmage that can't protect anything, running for his life when he has to throw the ball? And when we do the total math of this, we got to conclude this episode here. When we promise what is the win totals going to be, we're projecting, obviously you can't do a decimal, but we're projecting between 3 and 4 wins, slightly leaning towards 4. And when we look at the likelihood of winning the AFC South, it's 12%. So it's not exactly a rosy picture, but from all football metrics, defense that gets pillaged, offensive line that can't block, quarterback that can't process.
And Joe, as my final thought for Tennessee here is that we do have Tyjae Spears ranked within our top 15 of runners. And it's especially, we just said, they don't have an offensive line that's really good at blocking. But with a guy like Tyjae Spears and the situation that they're in, drafting a running back in the 9th, 10th round that could potentially get you a volume of targets is kind of what you're looking for in round 9 and 10. And
the other thing with Tajee that most people think he runs like Henry, he's much more like White down in Tampa. He's going to catch a lot of swing dump off passes, which is why he, of all the Titans, is the one I'm personally biggest on. He's going to catch a lot of swing dump off passes when a quarterback's running for his life. I expect 60 catches out of Spears and 1,200 total yards.
That's a big
I think he's the steal of the late rounds, not Pollard, Spears.
I think we're probably looking more for Tyjae Spears. We're probably looking more in line for maybe like 750 yards rushing. I think probably about 400 yards receiving.
That's about 1,200 total.
Total yardage of 1,200. You could probably see some down the field targets, or he kind of gets open. Probably about 4 or 5 touchdowns, which if you're drafting a running back in the 9th round,
that's a win.
And he's getting targets, probably about like 40 to 50 targets. That's a win in our book. And
it's a major win.
You know,
so Titans fans, sorry we didn't have a greater answer for you, but you got to tell people the reality as it is. Click on the next episode. Watch the Colts.